Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's a real pleasure to come and give evidence to your committee. I'll try and assist you as best I can. One caveat, in relation to dates and details from when I was Secretary of State, I may have to come back to you if my memory fails me, but I will try and give you as much detailed help as I can. I think in relation to the withdrawal agreement, and in particular the backstop arrangements in the Northern Ireland Protocol, it's important to understand the two paradigms here. I think, and I'd say this as dispassionately as I can in relation to motivation or political intent, but there are two basic concepts at play. One is that you avoid what I think we all want to avoid, which is any hard border between the Republic and the North, by a process of high-level legislative and regulatory alignment. And that is effectively the approach that the EU has adopted and is reflected in the EU withdrawal agreement. The second paradigm is to say we respect and we understand your equities in protecting the single market regulations, but in the modern world with technology, with decentralised processes, this can be done away from the border. So I visited Northern Ireland and went down and had a look at the various different points from Crossmaglen to Newry, Warren Point Port. I went to the Port of Larne, and that's obviously important for the animal checks. And I looked at how an intelligence-based approach to checks away from the border could be done. I think if you want the finished article, and I don't want to waffle on at great length, although I could easily be tempted down that path, I think the paper produced by Shankar Singham and Robert McLean and Hans Meissen on the 12th of December sets out in a lot of detail what the technological paradigm could look like. But I think the key question will be around that. And it could either be a wholesale replacement of the backstop or in relation to the exit. And there's been a lot of discussion about exit. It could be in relation to a unilateral mechanism we can control with assurances to our friends and partners in Dublin and in Belfast that those arrangements in time could oversee the legislative paradigm that I mentioned at the outset. But that's, I think, the key choice that there is to be made. Both can avoid any infrastructure at the border, but one is clearly more acceptable to the UK Parliament.
Can that be arranged within 2 weeks? That sounds like a fairly wholesale revision to the withdrawal agreement that was in principle accepted last night in large part. But do you think it's realistic to make those sorts of changes within the time frame available?
You mean in terms of negotiations rather than the operational infrastructure?
Of course. I think we can accept that the changes to operation, we've heard evidence along these lines, is going to take some 2 years probably, which is perfectly fine in relation to the time available to us potentially. No, I mean the negotiation with the European Commission, whether they are likely to be able to get their heads around such a dramatic change to what is currently on the table.
I think text has already been offered up. I mean, the different groups and the outside interests have already suggested text. Where there's a will, there's a way. Yeah. So I think in terms of getting a deal done, I don't think it will be the technical drafting that should hold us back. And in relation to the infrastructure, I do think there was a quite important shift from Michel Barnier on the 24th of January, when he said, in relation to a no-deal scenario, which none of us want, or certainly I don't want, and I don't think on the EU side, and I take them at good faith, and I got to know them rather well. But he said, and I quote, "We would be obliged in the no-deal scenario, in relation to the border, we would be obliged to carry out controls on goods arriving in the Republic of Ireland. My team have worked hard to study how controls can be made paperless or decentralised, which will be useful in all circumstances." And he later clarified, and again it's a quote, that an operational way of carrying out checks and controls without putting back in place a border would have to be found. And the reason I found this interesting was because you're talking about at the end of the IP whether this could be done. Michel Barnier is saying it could be done in a no-deal scenario. If it can be done within 2 months, it must be possible to do it within 2 years.
All right, that's super. Now, it's often said by the European Commission that the UK needs to come to the Commission with proposals. There's a constant refrain from Michel Barnier that they can't negotiate with a party that doesn't come up with proposals. It sounds as if we certainly have proposals now. Is it the case that during the time that you were Secretary of State for exiting the European Union, you put to the Commission alternative arrangements of the sort you've just described and referenced? And if so, what was the attitude of the Commission at that time?
So the way the negotiations were structured, and there's a whole other debate around this, is that we have the technical teams, the civil servants, doing the working level groups in Brussels, and that would effectively be triaged up to the meeting of political principals, which was myself and Michel Barnier. Obviously the Prime Minister was in the lead of the negotiations, but in practice that's how it worked. I think in relation, I wasn't there day to day managing the technical negotiations, and so that's an interesting point as to what precisely changed hands, and I can't vouch for that firsthand, but it was clearly being discussed, and indeed I discussed it at the political level with Michel Barnier on the 26th of July, which was pretty, I think the second meeting I had, and I made it very clear, both as a matter of the acceptability to the UK, but also what I thought would pass in Parliament, that we would have to have a finite backstop arrangement, and we talked through how that might happen. And at that point, he said, "I understand it needs to be short." And my feeling, if I look back, and I don't want to, I want to be as dispassionate about this as possible. I don't think we grasped that opportunity then, and even then, July was quite late in the day, to thrash out with slightly more room for manoeuvre and breathing space the detail of that. But it was certainly in play, and I think in principle that was understood. Of course, they've reneged on that in due course, or say reneged, that's too strong a word, let me correct that. That was not followed through, I think, with enough vigour on our side, despite my efforts and advice.
In your view, is the backstop in place in order to make the border look and feel very much as it is today? And the committee was on the border as it happens yesterday. It was very nice and beautiful and peaceful, and should remain so. Or do you think it's a mechanism for holding the United Kingdom in a customs union potentially indefinitely?
So I never wanted a negotiation to impugn bad intentions to any side. But in terms of the substantive issue on the border in Northern Ireland, again, I've been down there, I looked at it, and at some length I met with the leaders of all the main political parties at Stormont House, from Arlene Foster through to Michelle O'Neill and Mary Lou Donaldson. And so I got a sense of the politics as well. I think the substantive issue in relation to the border is eminently solvable with goodwill, practical cooperation and technology and the decentralised processes Michel Barnier referred to. I think there are certainly some, whether in Dublin, some in Northern Ireland, and certainly in the Commission, who have seen this as an opportunity to choose the high-level alignment approach to the backstop to control the UK after Brexit. I have absolutely no doubt that there are some voices for that, and indeed it was regularly reported to me via the diplomatic channel, so through our diplomats, that there were voices to that effect. I think we would be naive to think that wasn't part of the debate.
Okay, that's very helpful, thank you. Lady Herman.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. It's very good of you to come and give us an hour, I think, of your time. We'd hoped a little bit longer, but it's just an hour. You were able to explain at the very beginning of your evidence what you understood as the alternative arrangements to the current backstop. It's very striking yesterday that the Prime Minister wasn't able to explain what the alternative arrangements were. It's very striking that the mover of the amendment, Graham Brady, wasn't able to explain what the alternative arrangements were. And it's very, very striking at the end of the debate that the Brexit Secretary, your successor, still wasn't able to explain what the alternative arrangements were. Now, you voted for the amendment last night. Why do you think it is that none of those people could explain to the House of Commons before we voted what they believed were the alternative arrangements?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that I don't want to speak for the government or impugn the government. I think that they made the right decision. I also understand, having been in the position myself and come to select committees and studiously tried to avoid giving too much detail, that as we go back, the UK government goes back to Brussels with this mandate for change, it will want to protect the integrity of the negotiations. But I think in terms of the detail, whether, for example, it's animal checks and the, I don't know whether the committee has visited Port of Land, but it's very interesting how that works in practice, through to customs regulations and processes and the declarations that will be required, or indeed VAT, which I think is a significant issue for small businesses in Northern Ireland. I think the key point is that in all of those cases, you can conduct the checks, which I understand that EU say they will need to protect the single market, without having any infrastructure at the border. And I thought the evidence that John Thompson from HMRC has given in relation to that at the very expert level vindicates that. But I can't really, in fairness, account for why and what.
I think that's the answer. You can't account for why no one yesterday was...
Well, I'm not in the government, Lady Holmes, so I want
Yes.
to be fair to them, but give you my sense of what the situation is.
Yes. Well, do you think, being an ex-Cabinet member, do you think the Cabinet is agreed about what the alternative arrangements they're going to request from Brussels? Do you think there's agreement, unanimity in the Cabinet?
But again, I mean, you're doing your job very well in putting me on the spot. I don't know. I wasn't at the Cabinet meeting yesterday morning.
Of course you weren't.
But what I have to assume, because I think it's the way we behave, and there were no resignations yesterday, is that the Cabinet backed the approach that the Prime Minister took into that debate. And if not, we would have seen resignation,
Yes.
and
Yes.
that's the basic constitutional principle of our government.
So the approach that the Prime Minister took into the debate was not to tell anybody what the alternative arrangements were. Could I just reflect to you the fact, and it is a fact, that a considerable number of businesses, farmers, fishermen and community leaders across Northern Ireland supported the backstop arrangements and the Brexit deal as had been negotiated. So what would you like to say to them this morning, having supported an amendment which just completely ignored their views and their support for the backstop and the Brexit deal?
Well, I don't think it's fair to say that they've been ignored. There's a difference between taking into account someone's view and then following it. I think there's a whole balance of economic considerations. When I was out there, I visited the Newry Chamber of Commerce. So I know, having talked firsthand to businesses, Warren Point Port is very interesting in relation to trade both ways, and so is the Port of Larne. I guess the question that we'll have to work out collectively as a country and as one United Kingdom is preserving the balance of, and not just preserving. Let's not make this a risk management exercise alone. It's also about grasping opportunities. But you have that significant swathe of north-south trade, which is crucially important, that we want to protect. It has a very huge SME focus. But you also have the massive east-west trade that I think we also want to protect. And indeed, in the joint report, paragraph 50, between the UK and the EU back in December, is something which was set out, both sides agreed, shouldn't be interfered with. So I think the point is to try and maximise and protect both sets of trade and then build on them in the future with the opportunities of Brexit. So their voice has been heard. Certainly I went and talked to them. But there is also, I guess what I'm saying to you is the east-west and the north-south trade needs to be looked at in the round.
The question, I think, is do you appreciate how disappointed they might feel that suddenly, out of the blue, last night, what they had expected to happen has been thrown out the window, and the Prime Minister is going back to Brussels to negotiate a completely different, well, we don't know, alternative arrangement to the one that they had firmly supported in very large numbers?
Well, I think the way I would want to put it to them, in order to reassure any concerns they might have,
Yes.
is that we want to protect their trade. We want to avoid any return to a hard border. We've all agreed on that. The question is how that should be done. And we're very committed, with goodwill on all sides, south of the border, in Belfast, amongst, I know, the diverse communities we've got there, and working with the EU to make sure the technology is in place, the operations are in place, the decentralised processes are in place to protect that north-south trade. Mm-hmm. Equally, I think it's axiomatic, if I may put it that way, that after the biggest parliamentary defeat in history, the deal that you're talking about is going to have to be revisited. And I'm sure, actually, a lot of people across all the different views will have recognised that.
Well, I think the political declaration could have been looked at with the greatest respect. However, could I just ask you, since you had such a critical role as the Brexit Secretary, I presume that in fact you had read the Belfast Agreement. Please don't line up behind the Immigration Minister and tell us that you haven't read the agreement.
I haven't sit down and started at the beginning and gone through it,
Yeah.
but of course at various points in the negotiations, when issues have been raised, it has been an important opportunity to delve in to the different aspects very carefully.
So which aspects of so you haven't read the Belfast Agreement in its entirety?
I haven't sat down and gone from, I've used it as a reference tool, to make sure that I understood and could satisfy and reassure myself that in relation to the commitments that were made on both sides in relation to the joint report in December, which was the basis of what we were going to do on the backstop, that we're not impinging on anything required by the Belfast agreement, and also to make sure more broadly, in the positive sense, that what we're doing can promote peace, stability, notwithstanding what I recognise is a difficult set of questions for the people and the communities of Northern Ireland.
So you're confirming that you haven't read the Belfast Agreement, you were the Brexit Secretary, the backstop, the arrangement with Ireland.
I'm answering all your questions to the best of my ability.
Yes, but
and I'm doing it honestly.
Yes.
So it's not like a novel, you sit down and say, do you know what, over the holidays this is a cracking read. But it is an absolutely vital constitutional document, and I consulted it at every moment where, either as of my own initiative or whether as a result of advice of officials, an issue was raised to satisfy myself that we would never do anything, not only to undermine the letter, but also the spirit of the Good Friday Agreement, or indeed the political stability that I'm sure in good faith we all want to preserve.
Good. And could you just confirm, for the record, that you did read the provisions in the agreement which referred to a border poll?
I am familiar with those. I don't have a copy of it in front of me if you want to test me on the detail, but I am familiar with those.
Yes. And
we're running short of time.
We're running short of time. Thank you, Chair. Could I just wind up then and just say, well, what's next for Dominic Raab?
I don't think, in fairness, Lady Herman, I matter very much. What matters is that Parliament has given this Prime Minister, in a sensible way, a mandate to go and get the change we need. And also, I think, and this is slightly broader probably than the remit of your committee, that all of the other attempts, the sort of parliamentary guerrilla warfare that was being threatened, were seen down. We're not going to get this supposed parliamentary wresting control of the direction of these negotiations, which I think would be a big mistake. Actually, there is now a clear line of sight for a deal with the EU, and the ball's in their court to show the pragmatism and flexibility that I think we've demonstrated.
Yeah, thank you. If I may, Jim Shannon, and appeal for brevity.
First of all, Dominic, can I just say how very pleased and proud we were of you taking the decision you took, principal decision, and the way you've conducted yourself up until now, and indeed in this committee this morning, and the answering of the questions so far. Just for the record, Mr. Chairman, I'll just put it on record that the fishing sector that I have the privilege to represent are very clear. They want to leave. There's no doubt whatsoever amongst those fishing sector in my constituency in Portavogie. Indeed, my discussions with other fishing sectors at Ardglass and Kilkeel and elsewhere as well. And within the farming community, of which I declare an interest as a member of the Ulster Farmers Union, myself, my neighbours are very clear. They want to leave the EU. So from the farming point of view, for the record, accurate, evidential base, of course I have for saying those things, both farming and fishing want to leave the majority of that. Whenever you explain them the constitutional position to the farmers in the sector, then they're very happy to move on. In relation to very quickly, Mr. Chairman, and I'll take your brevity and my question. At what stage, Dominic, did you say to yourself, as you went in as a minister for exiting the EU, there came a stage where you said to yourself, this is not going to work, there's no follow through from the EU, and therefore you took that principal decision to resign. If you just very quickly tell us about that there. And the second question, because I'm very conscious that others want to ask questions as well, is what do you see in the agreement, potential agreement that our Prime Minister could now do with the EU, if there's a willingness to do so, and how you see that border can work in a way that there's no hard border? Those are my two questions, Mr. Chairman, and that'll be it.
Thank you, Mr. Shannon. So, I don't want to sort of dwell too much on my resignation, but you've asked me a question. I want to give you a clear answer. I could see immediately on taking up post that there was both a path to get a deal done, but also some obstacles that would need to be navigated. The crucial one was making sure that any backstop that required Northern Ireland to sign up to on its own to either customs regulations or wider regulatory provisions of the EU would risk and come into conflict with, I think it's paragraph 50 of the joint report. And if that was the path we're going down, we would need to put in some safeguards, including an exit mechanism. So one of the things I was focused on, as I mentioned back early in July, is being very clear that for all the talk of best endeavours and temporary, we had a clear exit mechanism or a sunset clause from the backstop. I think as late as October, in my discussions with the Irish government, as well as in Brussels, and the discussion in Parliament, that we would, in terms of reading what the parliamentary support would be, I think it was probably still in play at the end of October. And really, I wanted to, I didn't relish resigning, and so I fought until the very end when we had the 5-hour cabinet meeting, and tried to make the case that this would have to change, either to be acceptable to the United Kingdom or indeed, from a practical point of view, to pass through Parliament. And so it wasn't until I resigned that I took the decision, but that was the process. You asked about what the change would be. I think the crucial thing to change the backstop is to move from the high legislative alignment paradigm of avoiding a hard border to moving to a technologically decentralised, process-driven approach, which is what the modern world will do. This is what the digital age will do in global trade. And I think not only does that make sense in terms of commerce, but also in terms of sovereignty. And so I think whether it's in relation to the backstop as a whole, or indeed allowing it to be finite so we can transition to, let's call it a technologically driven approach, either of those two options, in my mind, would be acceptable. And there's lots of detail to that, whether it's the customs side, the animal standards check sides, but that's the paradigm I think we need to shift to.
So the point then is very clear that you see yourself, Dominic, and many of us will probably also agree with you, that you see little or no change in the border as it is at this moment in time, and the changes when it comes to trade will be technological, will be done by drones, done by paperwork, done by work beforehand. Really nothing should change, because that's what Stephen Coveney says. They don't want a hard border, except for that ragtag army they have, of course, by the way. But in relation to not wanting a hard border, I'm just very curious how that's the way it will be, a soft border as it is at this moment in time.
Yes, I think that's doable, and the real expert, of course, is John Thompson. He's confirmed that that can be done in terms of the practical arrangements, and of course Michel Barnier has confirmed that it can be done. The question is now one of political choice.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
You'll be aware that we had a sunset clause as an amendment to the withdrawal bill, but it was withdrawn. Now, from what you say, sunset was very much being discussed in the Commission until relatively recently. Do you think that's something that the European Commission would be still receptive to, or do you think we've moved past that, since it would obviously deal with one of the main concerns?
And I thought it was an eminently sensible proposal. I think there's two ways of dealing with it. There's three ways. You either change the entire paradigm from the start, so you don't have a legislative alignment approach, you have an operational technology-based approach, or you limit through time or an exit mechanism the legislative alignment application to avoid impinging on paragraph 50 of the joint report. The problem is that if you take the history of the negotiations and you never start from scratch, I didn't start from scratch, I went in July after the Chequers proposals. There's no point in trying to say, okay, new guys coming in, I'm going to stop everything right now, we're going to start again from the beginning. That doesn't work in a negotiation. And what was clear to me is that in Dublin, and I don't want to get into their domestic politics, but politically they're taking a very firm line on a deadline. And therefore it seemed to me, in terms of coming to a solution that works on all sides, a more pragmatic approach was to look at an exit mechanism. And that was discussed at great length with all the relevant cabinet members, particularly the Attorney General. And politically, I think one of the aspects here is going to be finding a ladder for the Irish government to climb down. And I don't want to get into the politics of this too much, but we're naive to talk about this if we don't understand and appreciate it. And they took such a trenchant line on the backstop, and such a very political line on that, I think we do need to understand that we probably need to work together with our Irish friends to work out a mechanism that not only deals with the practical operational issues, but also is politically acceptable for them, because I think they are in a very difficult position now, the Irish government, and that's mainly, in fairness, you mentioned Simon Coveney, with whom I met, very constructive discussions, mainly because of the particularly strong political position that was taken by the Taoiseach.
Yeah, thank you. That's very useful. Kate Hoey.
Thank you very much for coming along. The word hard border seems to have been this, it's been kind of abused and misused. Do you just want to tell us very simply what your definition of a hard border is?
Well, a hard border means, I think in people's minds, in the worst case scenario, envisages or depicts going back to some of the checks that characterised the position before we had the Belfast Agreement, and with all the troubles. I prefer actually to think of it, and the threshold and the litmus test, if you like, is the one John Thompson used, which is no additional infrastructure at the border. And I think that's the key thing here. We don't want to have any of the infrastructure or indeed the symbols of a very troubled past for Northern Ireland. I think we all agree on that. But taking that away from the border, whether it's animal checks or registration or the other declarations, having trusted trader schemes, and all the other things that can be done and are done around reasonably porous borders elsewhere around the world, but nonetheless where regulatory checks need to be done, I think can be made to happen. And of course, the one thing that's very clear to me when I went down to South Armagh was that you do already have a regulatory border for that, for excise and for one or two other things. And of course, that's done and monitored and enforced without hard infrastructure at the border. So I think it can be done, but that's the way I view it.
And Michel Barnier making it so clear that if there was to be a WTO deal, that would have to happen in that way, that there wouldn't be a hard border brought in again, and there would be all those things that you've mentioned. Then it just strikes you as common sense that if you can do it under those circumstances, that we can't do it properly in a way when we're planning for it, and that does seem to lead to a feeling that there's more to it than just the idea that we want to not have a hard border.
I think it's become impossible to entirely separate the operational technical challenge from the political context.
Yeah.
So I agree with you.
And I just want to, I don't know whether you've heard of Professor Joseph Weiler. He used to be the president of the European Institute, professor of law, knows a lot about Northern Ireland. He's written a very interesting piece about how we should actually now be talking about a front stop approach, pointing out how when you travel from Ireland or Canada to the United States, you get off the plane and you go straight into America because everything's done at that end, and that there's absolutely no reason with the right goodwill that you couldn't have that kind of you would actually have front stop centres in the United Kingdom where everything would be cleared before they left to go to the Republic or whatever. There seems to be all sorts of sensible suggestions around. Do you think now, because of the vote last night, that we can get a situation where the European Union would start to be realistic about some of the things that could be done to get rid of this ridiculous backstop?
Well, I think you rightly point out that, and I was a former diplomat and I spent 6 years in the Foreign Office and I was posted to the Netherlands, and my non-European colleagues used to constantly say there's a big world out there and you guys are so consumed and inward looking in the EU you never look at the other practice. I think this is a good example. You mentioned the North American border, we know the Swiss border. There is global practice here about how you best manage a border, and funnily enough some of the commercially most efficient ways of managing those borders would also, I think, be politically some of the most palatable ways to approach this, with all the equities in mind. In terms of whether or not the EU will move, I think the EU's got a choice. The EU has been saying to us since the parliamentary defeat on the meaningful vote, what is it you want? BBC, all the other broadcasters and print press were saying, the EU is saying, what do you want? Well, we've now gone back and said these are the changes required. It's not rewriting the whole of the withdrawal agreement at all. It's not even calling for getting rid of the Northern Ireland Protocol. Of course, That's very important. It is saying that on the backstop, and in particular I think the exit mechanism, but the backstop as a whole, we need these discrete, focused and eminently deliverable changes. And I think the choice now is for the EU. Given what Barnier has said, it's not a question of whether this can be done, it's do they want it. So the EU will now have a choice to make. The legislative potential for knocking Brexit off course or preventing us leaving on the 29th of March have all been defeated in the Commons yesterday. The legislative proposals, the Cooper-Bowles Amendment and indeed the Grieve Amendment. So this is now a very clear choice for the EU, and both within Brussels and the Commission machinery, and there are diverse views in the Commission. We treat the EU like a homogenous whole, but it's not true. There are diverse views within the Commission, and there's certainly diverse views across capitals. Now is the point at which their minds will be focused. And of course they're used to driving these negotiations to the 11th hour. This is, I don't think the EU, they think we're particularly late in this negotiation.
But just one final point, and I know you don't want to go into great detail about what happened. I'm sure you'll write about it sometime in a book or expect, but just now, where we are now, do you not think that given some of the advice that the Prime Minister's obviously been given by officials who perhaps haven't been as knowledgeable as they thought they were, that now is the time to really beef up the negotiation team and make it much more political-led rather than official-led, and that actually there is a case almost for saying that the Prime Minister should take with her perhaps a politician from Northern Ireland who understands and is in this House and understands the situation?
I think it's a very good question. I think the likes of Peter Hennessy and the sort of constitutional historians, when they pore over the detail of this, will ask a lot of questions around this. We have two essential principles of our constitution, but they're written in as conventions rather than a written constitution. One is cabinet responsibility and the second is ministerial responsibility. And I think in relation to these negotiations, the meaningful exercise of ministerial responsibility has been fraught. I think you've seen it with my predecessor, and certainly I can think of the ways in which that's been the case. Certainly improved for a while, in my experience, certainly in July, but it frayed. And I think that it's a very precarious position to be in, and particularly right now. The civil servants do a great job, and I've got nothing but pride in the work that my officials at Executive did, and the Cabinet Office team as well. But this is a negotiation, and there needs to be a political endgame. And that endgame must be politically controlled and driven. And that can only be done at ministerial level. And I think also, realistically, the Prime Minister has said, and I think it's quite right, that she leads the negotiations. But in practice, given the level of detail, given the amount of time spent in Brussels, given that she runs the government as a whole, I think you have to have the Secretary of State exercising that day-to-day political oversight, who can control and direct the negotiating technical teams, and at the same time look back and come and be accountable to Parliament. If you lose that basic constitutional principle, I think the effectiveness of the negotiation is undermined. So the end game must be politically closed out.
Thank you.
Robert Goodall.
Thank you. How would you describe the working relationship between your department when you were Secretary of State and Number 10 during the course of these negotiations?
I had a very good relationship with the Prime Minister. I really enjoyed working with her. I got huge respect for her, and we had a frank conversation when I took the job about what was needed to make it work, and I wouldn't have taken it except on that basis. And so I don't really have any personal criticism. I think the issue is, given the context that I just described and what making ministerial accountability work in practice requires, I think there is a question mark around the extent of the licence given to the technical teams, and in particular the head of the technical teams, Ollie Robbins, for whom I have great personal affection and high respect, because I think at some point, if that licence is too broad, however brilliant they may be, you risk fraying the principle of ministerial accountability. And then when things do go or may go wrong, and hey, look at Salzburg and the response to the government's proposals there, and then look at the loss on the parliamentary defeat. I think those are two very concrete examples of where, with proper ministerial accountability, they might have been avoided or mitigated.
So were there occasions when you felt you were either being marginalised, outflanked or ignored when the lead was being taken by those officials? that you just referred to?
Well, I think there was always at least a theoretical maintenance of ministerial responsibility and accountability through the Prime Minister. But if you're going, the way I would put it like this, there's a big difference between a Secretary of State controlling and directing and taking the initiative with negotiations on the one hand, and on the other hand, a situation where both the Secretary of State but also the caucuses of Cabinet, the so-called SN Committee and the other subgroups of Cabinet that are supposed to be the exercise of the wider ministerial responsibility, if they're effectively doing a vetting exercise, so checking and sending the technical teams back. One is a reactive approach to ministerial accountability, the other one is a proactive approach. I think what we've lost is the proactive approach, which would allow the political contours to be defined and, if you like, the technical aspects to be fleshed out within those political contours. I do think that frayed.
And was that part of the sort of the run-up and the context of your resignation, that some of these factors were sort of dogging you a little, and that the point at which you resigned was the culmination of that, or was it just on that one particular issue where your resignation occurred?
Well, my resignation letter set out what I was worried about, and I can repeat it, but I'm sure you can all around the internet. But I wasn't really, I mean, the process is important. I'm a Foreign Office lawyer by training and trade. I was a Linklaters lawyer before that. I think it's important. I do think process and organisation allows you to exercise smart pressure in negotiation. And I did worry that without it, we would end up hitting the buffers. And I take no pleasure in saying I think that's what happened at Salzburg, and then with the meaningful vote. But ultimately, I was focused on the result. Because frankly, if I was cut out of the loop on one or other decision, but we got the right result, frankly, my position doesn't really matter. What mattered was I think, three flaws in the deal, all really focused around the backstop, which in the end rendered the deal fatally flawed. And so I guess I was results rather than process oriented when it came to the final decision, because I wanted to hang in there as long as I could to try and get the best deal.
Okay. And of course, all this time Liam Fox has been going around the world starting to talk about international trade deals. Was that something that your people and the number 10 people were looking at, how we could facilitate that, or was that always going to be a secondary consideration compared to just getting the deal over the line, getting to the first step on the ladder, rather than looking at where we're going to be when we're ready to sort of get onto that suddenly upland of international trade?
I had regular chats with conversations and working level discussions with Liam Fox, who's a brilliant colleague, and he was excellent at making sure at the forefront of our minds was not just the deal with the EU, but the global opportunities for free trade, whether it's tariff control or the non-tariff barriers, and the latitude you'll need in regulatory terms if you're going to do deals, whether it's with India, China, America or Latin America. And so we had those conversations. I think ultimately the question would be, when you get back to the whole, how do you reconcile the different interests and the different focuses, whether actually we lost sight a little bit of the global opportunities of Brexit because we were so focused on securing EU.
Yeah, that was basically my question in a nutshell.
Yeah, but I don't think. Liam will give you will give you a view from DIT's point of view. I don't think it was a question of not understanding those factors. I think the question would be the weight that was applied to them. For me, it was very important because they are the opportunities of Brexit. And I do think, as a whole, the approach to these negotiations has been too much about risk management, as important as that is, and not enough balance with the grasping of the opportunities. I'm saying we need a balance between the two. I think it became a bit too tilted towards the sort of accountant's risk management exercise. Thank you.
Ian, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for your evidence. I think if I was a headline writer listening to your evidence today, I would write, I think it's a fair characterisation, is that what you're saying is, if there is a will, there's a way. And it's really up to Europe now to help us in that. You sidestepped neatly one of the earlier questions about should someone else step in and help in the negotiations. Given that you've ultimately been proved right, if you were asked again by the Prime Minister to come into this negotiation process, to come back into the government, would you now do it?
I think it's very unlikely to happen, but look, I will, whether I'm in government or on the backbenches continue to do the only thing that really matters to me, which is try and get a good deal for our country, and if not, mitigate the risks of a WTO Brexit and grasp the opportunities. I think, you know, how I add value to that is secondary, but I retain a good relationship with the Prime Minister in the sense that we spoke before and after, and there's a lot of bad blood in politics, and there has been throughout the Brexit process. I don't feel that way about it. I haven't lost any friends over Brexit, and I don't want to do so now. But equally, we've got to get this right, because it's about our children and their children and the future of our country.
You've name-checked John Thompson from HMRC on 2 occasions. Do you think he would be a useful witness for us, given that you've drawn on his evidence twice now?
I think from a number of questions from the chair and from others, you're obviously interested in the technical aspects of this and how it can be done. I think John Thompson would be useful as a witness because he's already given evidence to other committees, and he's the real expert. He's the guy that's in charge of things like customs and borders.
He's been very shy when it comes to this committee, it has to be said. Maybe our reputation precedes us. I have no idea.
Well, I can reassure him what a wonderful bunch you are.
Lord Buie in the other place has gone on record. He's very senior academic, but also very, very closely associated with was an advisor to Lord Trimble when David Trimble was First Minister, and highly regarded for his expert knowledge. With regards to the Belfast Agreement, he said that the withdrawal agreement, as was framed before last night, that it actually drove a coach and horses through the Belfast Agreement because it was a top-down approach. It took away from Belfast the role that the Belfast Parliament or the Belfast Assembly would ultimately have, and that it was therefore fatally flawed, and people were undermining, maybe not understanding, but undermining effectively the Belfast Agreement if they supported the withdrawal agreement in that aspect. Do you think that the government, knowing that now and having that material from him, should look again at that aspect of it and realise that actually the best way to protect the Belfast Agreement, if that's their ultimate aim in all of this, is to then pursue a change to the withdrawal agreement?
So I didn't get the last bit, to push through
that it's important for the government to recognise that if they wish to really be the protectors of the Belfast Agreement, they must pursue this change
to the withdrawal agreement.
To the withdrawal agreement.
I think that's right. I mean, I'm looking back at some of my handwritten notes from the day of the big cabinet discussion, and I was worried about the VAT regime burden for Northern Ireland businesses. I was worried about 100% animal checks between GB and Northern Ireland. I was worried about the advice that GB would be treated as a third country from Northern Ireland for the purposes of the deal. I was worried about regulatory declarations for goods crossing between GB and Northern Ireland. And I just looked at that, and the way we had approached this with the EU through the joint report, which I think was poorly drafted and shouldn't have been agreed as was back in December, but nonetheless we were bound to. And I think when I looked at it, I struggled to reconcile what we're doing with paragraph 50 of the joint report in relation to the commitment to no new regulatory barriers without Northern Ireland Assembly agreement, so-called Stormont Lock, which was reaffirmed post-Salzburg. I struggled to reconcile that with unfettered access to the GB market. So we had, throughout this process, quite a few moments where the joint report was put back at us by the EU side, but without a focus on paragraph 50, which is where the equities that I think that this committee and certainly I and the government were keen to make sure were protected and preserved were lost sight of. And so I think for both the reasons you gave and also for those granular reasons, I think that's quite strong evidence to take back and say, look, this isn't just a question of the politics in Westminster. Look at the detailed implications that MPs, but also experts as the ones you cited, have been saying about this. This is not consistent with the commitments and assurances that have been made on all sides.
I must say, Dominic, that answer succinctly summarises the key assault that the withdrawal agreement had on the economy of Northern Ireland, potentially could have had on the economy of Northern Ireland and on the political relationships between these islands. And I thank you for that answer, because it's something which is those details of VAT, animal checks, third country regulation differences, all of those things are so significant and unfortunately have been ignored by a lot of the business people who were just wanted a deal. And I want a deal, you want a deal. But just searching a deal for deal's sake, we have to get the right deal. And what you put there to us, I think, is critically important. Were you amazed at the comments by Leo Varadkar last week about troops on the border? And where do you think that came from?
I've been surprised at the political approach that's been taken in Dublin, and I don't want to personalise it, but I think that's a good illustration of language which isn't desperately helpful, to say the least. And we want to retain strong relationship with our Irish friends and partners. And of course, you could argue that they've got most to lose, or they're at greatest risk in relation to the no-deal scenario. But I think some of that language has courted the very thing that they wish to avoid. And so I think even if I try as dispassionately as I can, it's difficult, we're here in Westminster, but even if I tried to do that, I would question the wisdom of some of those remarks.
Thank you for that. I wasn't sure if he was talking about his troops or our troops, but either way I thought they were ill-advised comments. Finally, if things don't work out in a final agreement, what do you think the impact of a no deal would be on the Republic of Ireland? Have you done any study or looked at any of the impact that a no deal would actually have on the Republic of Ireland's economy, given their importance to us as a neighbour and our relationship with them?
I think there are ongoing assessments that are done on all the different aspects of this deal, and there's all the external studies that have been done. I think for the Republic, this is going to be a very big issue because of their exports to the United Kingdom, particularly if you look at the agricultural sector, but more generally. Of course, that's something we want to avoid. One of the things I was told in Brussels very early on, and I think it's important to understand the political context of this as well, without being dropped, is that stop talking about win-win. There is only lose-lose. And I challenged at every level this, because I understood why, and I do continue to understand why Brexit was something that the United Kingdom chose and has just got downsides for the EU, because it's another thing to add to a long list of problems that they've got, which they didn't want to have to deal with. But there is always an opportunity when you forge a new relationship to do things better and differently. And there is a win-win deal here. And I think that part of the challenge has been a politically very clear judgment that we cannot try and tease out the opportunities here. Now, if you look at the Republic, there is clearly a lose-lose scenario. But what we want to try and do is turn that around and look at win-win. And I think this is difficult for our EU partners to accept, and I understand all the reasons why that's the case. But if you're in a commercial negotiation, it's the way you would approach this. And frankly, I spent 6 years in the Foreign Office doing bilateral and multilateral negotiations, including investment protection agreements. You've always got to try and look for win-win. That thinking has just not been there. And I think what happened was that politics trumped the rational, mutual economic self-interest.
And you think if we got on to actually a trade discussion, that actually might take the politics out of it and focus on the really important thing that Brexit is about, and that's a new trading relationship?
I think that is the upside, and the security cooperation as well. We're bigger than some of our parts in Europe. We don't want to be part of the undemocratic political club, but that doesn't mean we can't be good neighbours. And I understand for them that they're worried about the precedent for this, because if a brave new relationship for the future works, who else will be attracted by that? The reality is the UK has been pretty unique, politically, economically, and in terms of the ties we've got. So it must be right, without setting the dominoes falling, to be able to say, let's look to the future and aim for win-win. And I still think now that's doable. But it's got to be reciprocated. That spirit in the negotiations has got to be reciprocated on both sides.
And the material that you've seen as Secretary of State, does it bear any relation to what appeared in Newsnight a few weeks ago, where it indicated that 5% of the Republic of Ireland's GDP would go in a no-deal scenario, and up to £9 billion of their trade with Northern Ireland or with the United Kingdom would disappear? I
don't recollect those figures as official advice, but I can see all the risks for the Republic, and that's why we need to try and get this deal across the line for us, for Northern Ireland, but for all our EU partners.
Thank you very much.
Very welcome. Dominic, could
Thank you.
I turn your mind back again to this whole concept of the prevention of a hard border? During your discussions with Michel Barnier and Simon Coveney and others, did they go into any detail about, setting aside the need to avoid it, about what it might constitute if it were to come about? What it exactly was that all of us want to avoid?
Is the question whether they said, well, if you don't agree to what we're doing, X, Y, and Z will happen?
Yeah.
No. And what we wanted to do, and in fairness, I think this was the right approach, is to say precisely to avoid that, ABC can be done along the lines that we've discussed, the technological paradigm, and look, tell us why it ain't so. And we had that argument, but I think we need to be realistic. That really there was a big political push for the high legislative alignment approach to solving the backstop, when actually an operational technological approach could deal with the problem substantively. And so, in my experience, that's the way the dialogue progressed.
It's just that in the course of the past few months, there have been all sorts of connotations about what a hard border would constitute. And some of that has driven the fear and anguish on the border, and I live close to the border. So did anybody outline about, I mean, we all know, all of us know what the borders of the past were, but they were there to try and prevent terror and murder and escape from Northern Ireland into the Republic for safer sanctuary. But nobody sort of talked about that, did they? Or did they mention that?
No, and in fact, my experience of talking with Simon Coveney and all of my Irish counterparts, at no point was that either put that out as a realistic prospect, possibility, let alone, if this is what you're asking, a threat.
Right. And nobody produced any sort of throwback to, say, a customs post being blown up in the 1970s as evidence of what might return? I
think, in fairness, the troubles of the past were never far from our concerns and fears, but no one ever put that to me in the terms that you just have.
Okay.
I think we all, sorry, to be clear, we all just agreed we never want to go anywhere near that.
Yeah, oh yeah, of course. I'm just trying to get, because
Sure.
there is this fear of what may happen, I think it is important to try and analyse what it is everyone is trying to avoid. So did anybody then, so nobody said about what it might constitute, did anybody say then who would implement it if a hard border came about?
The discussions just never progressed down that line.
Right.
We were all committed to avoiding the scenario you're depicting.
Okay. So there was this sort of awful scenario, but nobody said, this is what could happen, this is what this would entail. Nobody elaborated on that or went into any detail about what that might be.
You were asking me, I think, in relation to the Irish government. I think in Brussels...
or Brussels, yeah.
I think in Brussels the suggestion was made, well, we will have to do these checks, X, Y and Z. They will have to be done. And in order to avoid this, you, Britain, United Kingdom, that has voted for Brexit, are going to have to agree the high legislative alignment approach to avoid that. But I think it never really progressed, and we would have been very sensitive, and indeed I was very sensitive in these talks, of any suggested threat. If you don't agree what we're saying, there'll be checks that we will demand of the Republic here, here and here. Yeah. Because we would immediately retort and respond and say, you don't need to do that, that will be your choice. And in fact, in one of the meetings I had with Michel Barnier, I made it clear on behalf of the UK government that we would never countenance or implement a return to the hard border. I pointed out that I believe that was the position of the Republic, and I asked the question, are you really realistically going to do it? And it was pretty clear to me from the rather carefully worded response that the EU are not going to do that. A, because it's unnecessary, and B, because is that really going to be the European Union's legacy in the spirit of European unity, and with all the history from the Balkans through to Catalonia? Seems to me obviously not a serious prospect.
Yeah, and so nobody got into the detail of saying if some form of checks were required at a hard border, that it would be exceptionally difficult to put 300 of them there at the crossing points, every single one, Because if you didn't do that, everyone would know a way around the ones that were there. Did anybody get into that level of detail? Or maybe that would be to outline the absurdity of a hard border.
Yeah. I don't think I think we worked out the absurdity before getting to that point.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Thanks.
Nigel Wells.
Back to the definition of the hard border, Dominic. When you were negotiating the backstop with Michel Barnier, was there ever a discussion of actually defining what we were guaranteeing not to have?
Not in sort of abstract conceptual terms. I think whenever we talked about checks, the EU would say, I paraphrase, we've got to make sure that our rules are respected and our equities and the indivisibility of the single market and the integrity of the single market is preserved. And we would say, and of course, you don't need checks at the border for that.
But you said that your kind of like natural definition of a hard border was physical infrastructure on the border. Would you say that's what the EU's understanding of hard border means as well? Do they have a somewhat broader definition in mind?
I'm not sure I've ever asked that in conceptual terms. That tends to be a debate between the UK government and the Republic of Ireland, or the discussions that we have in Belfast. I think the EU just say we've got our rules and they've got to be enforced. That's the approach that they take. And we say, well, we understand that and we respect that, and let's work out a way, let's have in effect we've got a sort of analogue approach and a digital approach. And I think the UK approach was to say, let's grasp the technological facilities that you've got for that, let's look at the global practice, and we can make this work. And you see it, not even the technical way, you see it in Port Villard, with the way that they approach animal safety, intelligence-led approach. 10%, I think, something like that, of the animals are taken off the truck. That's the way globally those checks are dealt with, and that's not done at the border. So those are the kind of responses that we would make. So I don't think I quite got into the conceptual definition. I suppose I was practically trying to just work through the problems.
But the test for any future partnership to be sufficient not to have to need the backstop involves a load of pretty woolly terms around not creating a hard border and enabling the all-island economy and a couple of other things. I mean, you've obviously got a long experience in law. Would you ever let a client sign an agreement with a material condition without knowing what the terms in that condition actually meant?
Just to make sure I understand you correctly, Mr. Mills, are you saying that actually the practical operation of those checks was left until after the withdrawal agreement was signed? That was the way.
What I'm saying is the withdrawal agreement, the backstop section says the future partnership must meet the following tests before the backstop can be let go, in effect. And those tests basically are no hard border, enables the all-island economy, and a couple of other things. But nowhere do we define what no hard border and what the all-island economy actually involves or doesn't involve. I'm saying, isn't it a bit unusual to have a very, in many places, very detailed and very complex legal agreement, which is what this is, have a fundamental clause which sets the conditions for what our future partnership must look like, not to actually define the key items in those conditions anywhere in the document, so nobody actually knows exactly what those means or what you have to do to satisfy that test. I mean, that's not a legal document I would have thought I would ever want to sign.
So I think there's a 500-plus page withdrawal agreement, including the protocol, and that's before you get on the political declaration. I think the two key things are, on the UK side, we were focused on this being subsumed as quickly as possible by the future relationship. In fact, one of the interesting arguments when you talk about sunsets and how long the backstop will be in play is that if it really was going to be in play for a very short period of time, it would be a rather curious thing to set up all of those checks wherever they would be, only for a different arrangement to apply in the future. And the approach of the UK government throughout has been to try and leverage that conversation into what is the future relationship going to look like in order to avoid any extra infrastructure at the border and facilitate trade. And that's why you come back to the crucial issue of, you may be right, you could have taken a more or less prescriptive approach to setting out how those checks would work, but what matters really is how you get out of the backstop. And I think ultimately the number one issue is that mechanism. And the big problem, I think, with the issue that you've alighted on is that there will be no exit from that set of arrangements that we couldn't control. Because maybe it doesn't matter the concern you're raising so much if there's good faith, and in any event you know that you can exit it. It matters a lot if actually you're tied into it indefinitely.
Yeah.
Good. Thanks, Chair. You said that you visited South Armagh. How long did you spend there, and who did you meet?
So, and I wanted to do this properly and not just do, a flyby or a political grip and grin. So we went the night before, and I toured the border with the PSNI from Crossmaglen to Newry, so looked at police stations, the border crossings, and really got a sense of what it meant in practice. And it's beautiful, rolling hills of
it is now
around the border. I met with then Newry Chamber of Commerce because I wanted to understand the small business aspects of it. I also wanted to understand the international trade and the trade both ways, which is why I went to Warren Point Port. I mentioned the Port of Larne, so we spent some time and I followed some of the checks that were conducted and went and had a look at how it was done. So with some of these things, you talk about these things on paper, but you need to visualise them. And I met with the leaders of all the main parties at Stormont House, as I've already described. So
specifically in South Armagh, in the border community, you spent a couple of hours being driven around by the PSNA. Looking at border infrastructure.
The best part of the morning, yeah.
Best part of the morning. Did you stop at any point to talk to anyone who lives there and ask them what their what their definition of a hard border is? Because I'm less interested in your definition of a hard border. I'm more interested in what the definition of a hard border is according to people who live there and use it every day.
Well, I understand the point you're making. I think the advice was to avoid what would inevitably end up being a political scrum, because you'd get local political representatives trying to hijack that. If I'd have thought that there would have been an opportunity...
So local political representatives who are elected by people who live there, you weren't prepared to meet them?
No. I went and met with every leader of every political party. I went and talked to the people that ran the port facility at Larne, the Warren Port facilities, and I met with the Chamber of Commerce in Newry, so I would get a sense of people who, whether from business or all different walks of life, whichever sectors, could give me that personal flavour you're talking about. But I also took the advice of the PSNI about the best way, sensitively, to manage a UK politician, Brexit secretary, going along that border post, the border crossings, if I could. And so I took the advice on that. And what I wanted to do is take the time to do it sensibly and properly as I could. And of course, there were, when I arrived, because people got wind, people looking to try and make their political point in terms of politicians. And I think that would have made it even more difficult to do what I understand why you're suggesting. So feel free to criticise, but I took the advice.
So your department published a report outlining areas of cross-border work and cooperation. Do you know how many they identified?
Off the top of my head, without the documents.
It was 157. Many of those are predicated on Ireland and the UK's membership of the EU. Food, tourism, schools and colleges, farming, fighting crime, tackling environmental pollution, waste management, bus and train services, cancer care, GPs and prescriptions, gas supply, electricity supply. Did you talk about any of those things when you visited border communities with people who rely on those cross-border services every day?
Well, I certainly got a sense, and I think this came out very clearly from my conversation with the individuals and the businesses in the Newry Chamber of Commerce, of those issues and a flavour of what it meant in terms of real life for small businesses going back and forth. So there was an opportunity to discuss all of that.
So you met a preordained list of people to discuss very specific issues around trade in the economy?
Yes, we planned the visit, which is what you'd normally do if you went down to any area.
Correct.
To get the best
but
out of this.
You didn't feel it would be useful to engage with people who live there, with the community at large, with organisations and representatives of that community. You didn't feel it would be useful to talk to them?
Well, if I had done that, I suspect you'd be delivering the reverse criticism at me. But what I did do,
Not at all.
What I did do, which is the correct thing, I think, is from Michelle O'Neill, Mary Lou Donaldson, through to Arlene Foster, and everyone in between, including the Alliance, the Greens, the UUP, the SDLP. Make sure I met with the representatives from each one.
I get all that. It's not
each one of the communities you're talking about.
It's not a specific criticism of you. It's alluding to a more general point that I have listened to ministers and secretaries of state from the UK government who say they have visited the border. They have went to see the border. My contention is that this conversation is largely about technological solutions and trade in the economy and less about people. For people in those communities, and I'm from that community, I don't represent it, but I'm from it, for people in those communities, there is a concern, there is a fear, and there is a frustration that their voices and their views are not being heard. And quite frankly, when you talk about goodwill and acting in good faith, it's hard to see how they can trust any incumbent in your previous position or the UK government as a whole to act in their interests when they won't even meet them. That's simply the point I was
they're
making.
represented by you, and they're represented by all the parties whose leaders I met, and you're making your point in a powerful way.
They're not represented by me.
But if you want to raise a substantive point, I'm happy to answer it. I never turned down any meeting with anyone when I was Secretary of State. But that's the way our representative democracy works. But I suspect I'd have been criticised whichever way I had have approached it.
I don't think so. I think I'm making my point very clear about my criticism of how you did approach it. And my final point is, I listened to Micheál Martin, the leader of Fianna Fáil, on the radio this morning. You were on the wireless this morning as well, I think, weren't you? And in fairness, Dominic, you have been a very good witness, and you've been very clear, and you've been very concise. I just don't agree with a lot of what you have said. But I think there is a delusion here that somehow the normal sort of internecine politics of Dublin is driving the attitude of the Irish government. Anyone who listened to the leader of the opposition from the Irish Parliament this morning would have realised that in contrast to us, the Oireachtas is completely unified in its approach to this. The Taoiseach is not under any domestic political pressure from opposition parties who are fully supportive of the stance of the Irish government. And you mentioned again this morning that somehow the Taoiseach's position was to adopt a harder line, or at least alluded to this, than the Foreign Minister. Now, you said a couple of weeks ago in the media that Simon Coveney had told you privately he was open to alternatives on the backstop, but that the Taoiseach adopted a harder line. Now, he said that is categorically untrue. So who are we to believe? And is that an example of the goodwill that you had hoped to engender between both governments?
Well, in fairness, I met with Simon Coveney twice. The fact that we had a conversation which I was asked to keep confidential and then was made public by the Taoiseach, not by Simon Coveney, and was factually inaccurate, I think answers your question.
He says that's not true. I mean, he has categorically said that's not true. So is he lying?
He hasn't said what I've just said now is untrue. And by the way,
you know, this is really important, by the way, because you were Her Majesty's government's representative, and he was the Irish government's representative, and he says that what you have said is untrue, that did not happen, that conversation did not take place, and that what you have said.
When you say that
untrue.
Conversation, it is very clear that I had dinner with Simon Coveney.
Yeah.
He came,
and he told you that there was an alternative to the backstop, but that the Taoiseach wouldn't allow him to pursue it.
No, which is not what I said, not even what you quoted. What I made clear was that options for resolving this had not been closed down, but were then, when the conversation I had with him was leaked to the media in terms which were not factually accurate, in terms of the proposal that I had put forward privately and confidentially at his request, and it was leaked in a misrepresenting, inaccurate way by the Taoiseach directly. So, for example,
it's a pretty serious accusation to make against the head of
I'm just telling you the facts.
Another government.
And I'd have to look at the exact quote, but I think it was that I was insisting that within 3 months we would be able to exit unilaterally. This is just, and everyone within the UK government who knows that the approach that I've been suggesting in relation to an exit mechanism knows that that's not what I've argued for within the UK government, let alone with our Irish friends. So that is an example, I think, of...
so just for the record, you're saying that the Taoiseach deliberately leaked a private conversation between you and the Irish Foreign Minister?
Well, deliberate then assigns intention and motivation. What I've said...
It's not a court of law here, Dominic. You know, you've been clear and concise so far.
Well, Conor,
go with what I'm saying.
Conor, no, I won't go with what you're saying, Conor. What I'll do is correct you when you're wrong. Okay? And you're wrong. Okay? We had dinner...
What am I wrong about specifically?
Well, if you pause for breath, I'll explain it. You're wrong to suggest that I'm accusing anyone of lying. What I'm saying very clearly is that the meeting I had with Simon Coveney was very constructive. Both wanted to make this work. I found him a great interlocutor, and I urged him not to rule out looking at some of the other opportunities and mechanisms for dealing with the exit from the backstop. And we agreed, at his request, to keep that meeting confidential. I checked the media. I didn't comment on it. It was only commented on, not by Simon Coveney, but by the Taoiseach. So if you want to ask the question, it's did we agree to keep that meeting confidential? And then secondly, the question is whether the account of what I was proposing is what the Taoiseach leaked to the media or presented to the media. Now, I don't know quite the conversation Simon Coveney had with the Taoiseach, and I don't understand what the motivation may or may not have been. All I'm telling you is that was simply not what we discussed or what I proposed, and I had kept it confidential to protect the integrity of the negotiations.
Finally, Mary Colford.
Yeah, thank you. Just wanted to just clarify something that Conor said about people in some communities in Northern Ireland not being represented. They do have elected representatives. They choose not to come here to represent those views. So I think it's quite true to say that their voices aren't here. There's reasons.
No, my point was that Dominic didn't meet them when he went there.
No, but there are elected representatives.
And in fairness, I met with Sinn Féin.
So just to move the conversation on in terms of what is likely to happen next, given your experience in terms of being in part of the negotiations, there seems to me to get around the backstop three options. Either a unilateral exit's inserted into the withdrawal agreement, a time limit's put in so we can get out after a certain period of time, or there's no agreement at all and actually the withdrawal agreement falls. Given your experience of the negotiations with all the countries involved, what do you think the most likely outcome is going to be?
I think that's difficult to judge because it depends on political appetite. I think the one option that lies between those spectrum that you had and which I was interested in and which touches on what Conor mentioned earlier and I think is worth just bearing in mind is the idea of a review mechanism which could come into play to begin 3, 4, 6 months, let's choose it, and which then after a period, again, weeks, months, whatever it may be, would then only continue with mutual agreement. Effectively, that would allow us unilaterally to exit. And you could condition the exercise of that unilateral mechanism with assurances and conditions which would be around the technological reassurances that there would be no extra infrastructure at the border, but the checks would be done. I thought that was quite a practical, pragmatic approach to avoid what was very clearly ruled out, I think, in Dublin and the EU, which was a direct time limit, but to give assurances that somewhere between an EU veto over us exiting the backstop and them saying, well, you can't just unilaterally pull the plug on it, we could navigate this. And I guess the final point I'd make is there is no democratic country in history that has ever signed up to something that resembles the backstop without some form of exit mechanism. Because of the lack of democratic control we would have over a vast swathe of rules that would be applied to us. But I thought that that model that I've just described to you was a way that would, again, don't want to keep up, but we would win-win. It would avoid the red lines that have been set variously across the negotiating table and would be a pragmatic way to build up trust, because you'd have the review mechanism and you would be, I think, from the outset trying to work out what the operational technological solution would be, because you would know at some point it would be politically impossible for the UK to stay locked in. But you would, in effect, create a dynamic where both sides would work together. And I thought, looking at, the problem with this relationship we've got with the EU is not just a transaction, we're trying to build a future relationship. And therefore you've got to have mechanisms for maintaining, sustaining and feeding goodwill. And I felt that was an opportunity for doing that.
Okay, and from my experience of being frequently in both the Republic of Ireland and in Northern Ireland, the first question that people ask me about Brexit is, and this has been right up until the last few weeks, is it going to happen? Do you think a big part of this problem has been that the EU, the Republic of Ireland, have not really believed that Brexit is going to happen, and that's why they've been, less willing to kind of negotiate or be flexible in their negotiations?
Possibly, and I think that's why yesterday was quite important, because there's now a clear track to a negotiated solution, and I think a clear choice if that doesn't happen, which is that we'll leave on the 29th of March. So, and maybe some of that is as a result of the politics here, because the EU, and I'm sure in Dublin, very close, and in Belfast, a lot of close attention is paid to that. And, it's difficult to really sense what the appetite is, because there's been so much uncertainty in our politics here. Hopefully, one of the things we've got is some much greater clarity about the path to Brexit, that it will happen, and that it either happens with a deal, which would be my preference, or on WTO terms. And I do think that for all the immediate reaction that we had from political figures, frankly the usual suspects, that will be focusing minds. And of course the pragmatists and the moderates, not the ones that are first out on the media airwaves.
Okay, and my final question really is, I know you said you don't want to touch on Irish domestic politics, but, Leo Varadkar was a Taoiseach when you were Secretary of State, but your predecessor dealt with Enda Kenny. Did your department get a sense that the direction of travel, the resistance to some of the discussions, changed dramatically when there was a change of Taoiseach?
I don't know, because I wasn't there at the to do the before and after. But personalities do matter equally. I think we always take the view that the Irish Taoiseach is a friend of the United Kingdom, Great Britain, Northern Ireland, and we always want to try and make this work. But it does matter. This is a moment for leadership. I think Parliament stepped up to the plate, given the Prime Minister the mandate, and she's showing the leadership in going back to Brussels. And I think across the EU, on all sides, we need to see that reciprocated.
Okay, and the final question is, you said that we need to offer Ireland a ladder for them to climb up, to kind of get themselves out of the political... Climb down the political hole they've got themselves into. But what would that look like? Do you think that would actually physically work?
I think that's why I think the exit mechanism that I described, with the kind of effectively the ultimate ability after a certain period of time for the UK to control their exit, but with a string of assurances that we'd be provided at the operational level to give them the practical assurance and guarantees even that the things that they're concerned about would not happen. I still have not... I mean, there are plenty of other people that will come up with whizzier ideas, but it seemed to me that still remains the best pragmatic way to deal with the problem, but also to address the understandable political concerns in Dublin.
Well, Mr. Raab, thank you so much for being with us today. You've really given us a fascinating insight from somebody who's really been in the thick of it and continues to be heavily engaged in this material. Very grateful for your time today.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Order.